Hi everybody, thanks for joining us and welcome to the MLA Updates Impact Series. This is the second in our series for this year and it's designed as an opportunity to update you on the MLA key programs and work that we're investing in and being part of that are creating industry impact and supporting the industry's goal to not only double the value of red meat but also be the preferred source of protein. The full series goes over 5 weeks and it builds on our program from last year in 2020 where we used this process of 5 webinars to report back to stakeholders on the progress of so many of our really important research, development and marketing initiatives, and those webinars, as this one will be, have been on the website since then, and they've been a great resource that we can go back to at any time, and I know that I've used them a number of times to go back and pick up some of those specific activities and details, so they're a resource that we can access anytime during the year as well. So just a bit of housekeeping before we get moving. It's obviously a webinar today, so your microphone and camera are going to be automatically turned off. Following the presentations, there'll be a Q&A section and you'll have the opportunity to ask questions via the online chat function. So you'll see the Q&A function by either at the top right hand if you're using a laptop, or it's in the menu bar if on an iPad or a tablet, and it's the question mark inside the speech bubble. So just click on that and you can type your question in there, and any questions that we don't get to today, we'll still make sure we answer them afterwards and publish those responses along with the recording in the next few days. If there's any significant connection issue or dropout or anything major like that happens, then we'll either reconnect immediately or send you a new link. And we've said that at the start of all the last webinars this year and last year, and we've never had to rely on it, but just letting you know just in case. So onto the webinar for today, which is the second in our series. And it's Impact Through Sustainability Innovations. So to tell us more about these, today's speakers are going to be Mick Crowley, who's the General Manager of Research, Development and Adoption. He's going to facilitate the session and give us an overview of this really important part of our investment portfolio. David Beattie, who's a Group Manager for Productivity and Animal Wellbeing, and he'll dive into the sheep reproductive strategy and northern breeding business programs that are looking at social and economic sustainability through improved productivity, and 2 of our major big programs of work. And then Doug McNichol, who's a program manager for sustainability and innovation, will talk about the CN30 roadmap, productivity improvements that can be gained through sustainability practices, and the pipeline and tools that will help producers on that path to carbon neutral by 2030. So thanks everybody for joining. Trust that you enjoy the seminar, and I'll now hand over to Mick Crowley. Away you go, Mick.
Thanks very much, Jason, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. It's a pleasure to be with you, and we'll take you through the investments we're making along the supply chain that support the sustainability of our industry. It's really important when we're talking about sustainability that we are recognising that we're talking about the broader definition, and that is that we're covering off the economic, the social and the environmental sustainability of the industry. And the importance of doing that means that we have the opportunity to be productivity led and deliver those outcomes that improve animal welfare and look after the environment within which we operate. It helps us take a whole farm system approach and look at how we match the right animals to the production system, the breeding, feeding, finishing, and using the feedback that we get from the processing sector to help inform and understand how the production sector needs to respond. So it's about connecting the whole system. And I think if we do that, we can really make some significant progress in driving productivity whilst also having the evidence to support the environmental sustainability outcomes. So just moving forward onto the next slide, when we're shaping the investments that we make, we're consulting very broadly. We've been using the regional consultation model the way in its current structure for the last 6 years. And what we found was that the priorities that are being set across the regions haven't changed a lot over that time. And there's good reason for that, in that we have been investing in 3 to 5 year projects for new R&D. And it's important for us to think about how we then drive adoption of the outputs of R&D. And I'll touch on that a little bit more. But also, when you look at the big ticket priorities that have been set across the country, no single project on its own is going to deliver the impact that we need, which is why we've moved and shifted towards solving those big ticket producer priorities by forming strategic partnerships. Now, you'll hear a little bit more about these today from David and Doug, but I'll just onto the next slide, please. I'll just introduce them briefly. So when we were looking at tackling the big issues in Northern Australia, we're looking at improving weaning rates of calves in Northern Australia, looking at improving the breeder herd efficiency, particularly in terms of fertility, and reducing breeder mortality. To do that, we need to operate and look at the whole system. We can also make better connections with the market destination for those livestock. But the big driver behind having a more collaborative approach was to try and come up with, it's not one issue, and it's not one issue that covers all regions. So we need to take a more collaborative approach and looking at how we're managing these animals, looking at the feed base, looking at the production environment. We can match the right genetics to the environment, breed, feed and finish those animals appropriately. And we measure the success of this program of work directly through productivity gains, number of, improving the percentage of females having a calf every year, reducing breeder mortality measured by percentage gains, improving weaning rates. So these are very much productivity-led investments. Just moving on to the next slide. In Southern Australia, when we were engaging with the sheep industry, again, reproduction efficiency was top of the list. Number of lambs weaned, just reducing lamb mortality, improving productivity, reducing ewe mortality as well. So again, we're not going to solve these problems just with individual projects. We can develop programs of work where the projects connect with solving these bigger ticket priorities. And I think that's working because it allows us to bring producers, researchers, service providers, and investors together to collaboratively design the programs of work that we can then go and invest in on behalf of the industry. So just on to the next slide. And Doug's going to talk a lot more about our pathway or our progress towards carbon neutrality by 2030. But carbon neutral by 2030 is embedded in the red meat strategic plan in Red Meat 2030. And we're one of the few industries to make significant progress against the 2005 baseline year, where our emissions have reduced by 53%. But we've got a lot of work to do, and the roadmap connects what we need to achieve from an environmental outcome point of view with a lot of our productivity benefits that we can deliver along the way. So connecting the work that we're doing in being productivity led is equally delivering against that journey to carbon neutrality. And Doug will talk more about the strategic partnerships around carbon storage and emissions avoidance as significant investment areas for us on the roadmap to being carbon neutral by 2030. So just onto the next slide, and this is a really important component of everything that we do. When we start looking at those strategic partnerships that we're investing in, it's giving us the opportunity to balance the investments in new R&D as well as adoption. And what we're finding is that, when we were first setting up Northern Breeder Business and the Sheep Reproduction Partnership, well, we've been investing in fertility and herd and flock reproduction performance for a long time. And it's about how do we repackage up the information that we already know to connect with producers who are really wanting to drive changes in their business and supporting them to do that. So we've put a lot more investment into demonstration sites, profitable grazing systems where we are working with the private sector to work with producer groups to make changes in their business. And the measures of success are directly related to productivity gains. We're still doing large-scale awareness activities, and beef up and meat up forums are a core part of that. We have some short-term training packages, the Edge Network programs, Bred Well, Fed Well, are examples of short-term training, but the long-term practice change is where we're getting the impact in demonstration sites and profitable grazing systems. So the partnerships are allowing us to get the right balance between new R&D and adoption, and we'll continue to challenge that as we go forward. So just in summary from me, just onto the next slide, please. We'll continue to support the producer consultation framework because it is underpinning how we're setting our R&D priorities, and that will continue moving forward, and the strategic partnerships are in clear line of sight of that consultation process. We'll be striking a balance between R&D and adoption, and this is very much being impact-led. We're also able to look at other sources of investment in addition to the levy, so we can stretch that levy dollar further. We can attract private investment that we can match with federal government dollars through the MLA donor company to directly address producer priorities. And we're investing in strategic partnerships because it allows us to have a more collaborative approach to how those programs of work are designed, and then we invest in projects that directly connect to the programs, directly address those big ticket priorities. So it gives me great pleasure to now hand over to David Beattie, who's going to take us through the investments that we're making in his area of responsibility in productivity and animal wellbeing. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Mick, and good morning / good afternoon, everyone, wherever you may be today. It's fantastic to be able to build off what Mick has just given you as an overview. So, look, my role today and what I'm really keen to try and impart to everyone is, essentially building on what Mick's already touched on. So, how do we look at what we've set up from a producer engagement or producer consultation framework to build strategic partnerships and create focus to address some of those big industry issues, recognising that it's not only MLA that we need to have engaged to be able to, if we are going to have impact and be able to make change. And really, I am going to dig a little bit deeper and provide some more information around the sheep reproductive strategic partnership and also what we're referring to as NB2. So I'll be using those as examples today. Next slide, please. So just to start with where we've come from. So this has been, we've had a framework looking at from the north and the south and the west around our advisory committees and our RACs. Traditionally looking at an annual call, investing levies, and really trying to get producer priorities to create projects. And look, that's worked really well. And we have, over that period of time, we've got some tremendous outputs from projects. We've certainly collectively shifted from looking at smaller scale projects to larger projects and programs of work, getting researchers and producers to collaborate, and it's been, I think, a real achievement to that RAC and consultation process. Where we'd like to go, and if we're looking on the right-hand side of that screen there, is shifting to an investment call. So recognising that we probably need to be more agile and flexible, and be able to not just have MLA invest. How can we actually get others to buy in to be able to create change and scale up the impact that is coming from those producer priorities? So we want to shift from just levies, recognising that it really doesn't matter where we're getting investment from. So it could be from traditional levy funding source, the MLA donor company, a combination of both. And probably what I should have put in there is also recognising that there's others to also contribute if we have a common goal or target. The other area, I guess, is where there's a subtle shift is instead of being project focused and potentially having a scattergun approach, how do we actually get at that upper level and talk about what outcome are we trying to achieve, or what target and goal are we trying to achieve for industry, and how do we get there? So that's where that thought process around bringing together strategic partnerships has evolved to. And two of the great examples of that, which I'll touch on today, is the Sheep Reproductive Strategic Partnership and NB2. So what we would like to use this consultation framework for now is actually understanding how those priorities fit together in order to then potentially create a partnership, create focus, have a goal, and get others to buy in and deliver on that goal. Next slide, please. So the first one is around the Sheep Reproductive Strategic Partnership, and Mick touched on this already. What is this? Well, this is a long-term strategic program of work aimed at improving sheep reproductive performance and ewe and lamb survival. We've known for a long period of time that that's time and time again in our southern-based systems, sheep-based systems, that's a high priority. How do we get more lambs, reduce mortality, and improve the breeding performance of the ewe? Why? Improving reproductive performance, ewe and lamb survival. It's not just a productivity issue and a profitability opportunity, but it's also a potential risk around the social license piece. So the mission of the partnership is to profitably and sustainably increase lamb production through increasing weaning rates and decreasing mortality. It's pretty simple, but it's a common goal, and we can get buy-in and create change. There's a number of pillars of work, and I'll touch on these in the next slide, but I guess what I'd like to highlight is it really is largely adoption heavy focused, and I'll give you an example of our flagship program or project within that space. But we already know that there's a number of drivers or levers which producers can use to improve lamb mortality and ewe performance. So whether it's scanning and separating singles and from twins, smaller mob sizes, smaller paddock sizes, shelter, nutrition, there's a whole range of things that we know can make a difference. And how do we actually use those levers to create change? Next slide, please. So what we're building on is a known and proven adoption strategy. And this is our, I guess, a flagship project that we have under the partnership. So we have the ability to have both awareness and also demonstration. So this model is going to, this is a $4 million levy project. We'll have 3 focus farms across the southern sheep production systems. Many of you will know about the producer demonstration sites. So instead of having a handful, 2 or 3 demonstration sites dotted across the country, this is actually having 90 PDS sites, all driving practice change and impact around improving lamb and ewe survival. Sitting underneath the producer demonstration sites, we'll have 270 small producer-led facilitated groups engaged in those PDSs. So in total, all of a sudden, at scale, we have more than 2,000 participating producers to lift adult ewe marking rates by 10%, increase the number of ewe lambs conceived by 20%, and lift overall marking rates by 10%. So that becomes the common goal. Also sitting in with this project, we'll have a number of legacy learning packages. So how can we actually, built on success, how can we actually have something embedded to take forward? Next slide, please. So this is a bit of a visual around what this project looks like. At the top, we have that focus farm or focus farm systems. Underneath that, well, that's designed and managed by a protocol management committee. And we have sitting underneath that 90 PDSs. So a recognised number sitting under each focus farm. And on the left-hand side of that screen, that's really the participatory piece. So this is producers participating, changing, and adopting. Underneath that whole, the PDS structure, there'll be a number of these small groups facilitated by a service provider or consultant. So looking over the fence essentially at those PDSs and working with a facilitator to look at what's working and what's not working and how that then might be implemented and embedded on that particular producer's farm. So that's the Sheep Reproductive Strategic Partnership. We'll jump on to the next slide, please. And I'll move on to the NB2, which is Northern Breeding Business. So the aim of NB2, well, there's really sort of four key aims. The first one is the purpose or the aim is really to increase and diversify the investment that in R&D and adoption for the benefit of the northern beef industry. So again, recognise if we have a common goal, which in this case is around reducing or improving weaning rates and improving the breeder herd efficiency in the north, how do we get collective buy-in from other agencies or other organisations to come on board and drive that goal? So it's not just recognising that it's core MLA investment, but there's others that want to buy in and also invest in this area. The other aim is increasing engagement. So we've known for a long period of time that one of our, I guess, shortcomings is actually getting northern beef producers engaged in both R&D and adoption. So that's another big aim of MB2. And of course, the underlying or the underpinning aim is really to increase productivity and profitability from those northern rangeland systems. And that's all about reducing calf mortality and increasing the breeder herd profitability and reproductive efficiency. The fourth one, as mentioned in that slide in front of us all here, is increasing conversion of R&D output into industry and business outcomes. So we've invested significantly in the north from an R&D perspective. How do we actually understand what that output has given us and allow that to be adopted to get change? So they're the four key aims. If we move on to the next slide, thank you. The goal is quite lofty. So by 2027, the program would like to yield $20 million in net benefits per annum to more than 150 beef producers across the north through increasing production, the live weight of cattle. As I mentioned, as a minimum target, we're looking at engaging with 250 northern beef businesses, large ones, and over that 7-year life of the program, the goal is to increase weaning rates by 5%, decrease herd mortality rate by 1%, and have a 10 kilo increase in sale weight of cattle at the same age. All at the same time while operating economically and environmentally sustainable level of production and profit. How will we do this? Let me explain. If we jump on to the next slide, please. I've got a couple of visuals, which I think is easier than having words on a page. This is the first one. And if you focus on that green circle on the right-hand side, which was referred to there as pathway to practice, this is really, the change here is that we're really looking at having it producer-led. So instead of a push of R&D, how do we create an environment where there's a pull or there's a need for a pull of R&D based on a particular business? So the idea is we'll have a number of producer groups across the north. So these will be small, relatively small, regionally based, similar business interests with a group coordinator and a facilitator. So these groups will be set up and the initial tasks are around having a look at the business, so benchmarking and business analysis, at least to set a baseline or a benchmark. With your facilitator, then understand what interventions would we like to set up in order to get impact and practice change to improve those weaning rates and get better breeding herd efficiency. So that's having a discussion, understanding either what R&D is available or what other adoption mechanisms or pathways are available based on a particular business needs. So that's the difference. Let's do that. Let's have a benchmarking piece with small groups, understanding where that business needs to go, and then linking that back to what tools in the toolbox are available to make that change. Recognising then once that's done, then there'll be a feedback loop back into these other R&D program areas. So whether that's herd R&D or breeder management systems, feed-based R&D or environment R&D, there will be gaps. So how do we use that pathway to practice network to be able to identify those gaps and build that back into our investments around research and development? I'll jump to the next slide, please. And this is another, I guess, visual around how MB2 will work. And let's just step through that. So the first step is forming those small working groups, which I mentioned. Then there'll be a piece around training and mentoring. So we'll have facilitators embedded within those groups and a group coordinator, and there'll be various training and mentoring programs that can be undertaken. There'll be recording and baseline data requirements, but these will be quite consistent, so templates will be available to capture that baseline data. There'll be support there to analyse that data and then understand where the business wants to go. So it's as I said before, it's producer-led but based on the particular northern beef system. The opportunity then to look at trial and interventions and understanding what, as I said before, tools in the toolbox might be available from an R&D and adoption perspective. Monitoring and evaluation. So then it's really important that we understand the cost benefit of that practice change, setting up breeder herd management plans, and then linking that all back to understanding where the gaps are. So what other then investments do we need to make around R&D and adoption? Next slide, please. So where are we up to with NB2? So we have a management committee in place. We've certainly committed significant funding already in the projects that we have in place, with more to come. So this is $10 million of investment in both levies and MLA donor company. Those data templates have been developed and loaded and can be accessed on the NB2 webpage. We have a coordinator in place. That management committee has a chair and producers involved. A number of those pilot producer groups have been established and up and running. There's 6 of those to start with, and we'll build on those as the program develops. And we've certainly started training and skills development for the facilitators that have been engaged. So that's NB2, which in the interest of time, we'll jump to the next slide, please, which is my last one, and a little bit of a summary and take-home messages. So the strategic partnerships will help us create focus and address industry's big, complex challenges. So recognising that from a producer consultation framework, we certainly understand where the big issues are and those priorities are. How do we then set those goals and targets and get others engaged to help us deliver those and get impact for industry? The Sheep Reproductive Strategic Partnership will profitably and sustainably increase lamb production through increased weaning rates and decreasing mortality. So again, we know how R&D can shift the dial. I've sat down next to plenty of producers and they've told me how they can increase and improve both ewe and lamb mortality. And I guess it's a little bit frustrating that we haven't seen that shift. So how do we collectively engage to be able to demonstrate and then shift the needle with ewe and lamb mortality? And then with NB2, this is really addressing the 3 main threats to the northern beef industry: calf loss, low profitability, and low levels of adoption of proven management practices. So this is a program that's producer-led. Instead of a push, there'll be a pull of R&D. Thank you. Next slide, please. Which I will pass on to my colleague, Doug McNichol, who will talk you through environmental stewardship and some of the CN30 programs. Thanks, Doug. Over to you.
Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. Great to be with you. I'm going to be talking to you about 3 key things in the next 15 minutes. I'm going to touch on the carbon neutral 2030 roadmap for industry, a little bit around progress to date and the path ahead, and then leave the producers in the audience with some actions for today and some insights for tomorrow. Next slide, thank you. Mick mentioned this earlier, but the Australian red meat industry's Red Meat 2030 strategy, which was released by RMAC, sets the vision of doubling the value of Australian red meat sales as the trusted source of the highest quality protein. This will be achieved by focusing on product quality and key aspects of the industry, which are important to consumer and community trust, including animal wellbeing and environmental stewardship. MLA is identifying opportunities to generate and capture value for producers through environmental service provision alongside red meat production. That's alongside red meat production, not in place of red meat production. And this includes low carbon and carbon neutral livestock production systems. MLA, alongside our partner RDCs, AMPC and LiveCorp, plus multiple stakeholders are investing in technologies and practices to help industry achieve the carbon neutral 2030 target. In 2017, the industry launched the Carbon Neutral 2030 initiative with the ambition of achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. That's net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And this means that by 2030, Australian beef, lamb and goat production, lot feeding and processing value segments will make no net release of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. And progress is reported by the federal government's National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, and each year MLA commissions CSIRO to construct the Carbon Neutral 2030 account for the Australian red meat industry. Next slide, please. So in 2020, MLA released the Carbon Neutral 2030 roadmap because in 2017, the foundational research was done that could show that the industry could achieve a net zero position, but we recognised that we needed to table a document that described what a carbon neutral industry looks like and how we might get there in the future. And so we come up with 3 or 4 key work areas under the roadmap. And not surprisingly, first and foremost, we start with investing in our people. It's investing in producers, farm advisors, industry leaders, MLA's own staff to ensure that we have the knowledge and understanding to operate in what is a complex environment that is climate science as well as red meat value chains. The next 2 work areas are technology focused, where a lot of the action happens. So first and foremost, we're focusing on emissions avoidance in grazing properties, feedlots and processing facilities, and that's focusing in on technologies like genetics technologies that reduce methane emissions per unit of product, feed additives like red asparaginopsis or 3-NOP, as well as forages and legumes, deep-rooted perennial and digestible pastures, as well as tropical legumes like Leukina and Desmanthus, which have methane inhibiting properties. Thinking about processing facilities, that's energy efficiency technologies that reduces fossil fuel use, through to covering waste processes and extracting biogas to prevent methane loss in the atmosphere and generate energy on site. To help us get there under this area of emissions avoidance, we're recognising that we can't achieve our outcome alone, and forming partnerships is mission critical to significant change program in the industry. So we have formed an emissions avoidance partnership comprising more than a dozen partners, some of Australia's best research organisations, CSIRO, some of the country's best universities, multiple state government organisations, and private enterprise with great ideas and technologies for the industry. And so we spent a number of years forming a partnership, which has been running to ground as we speak and getting off the ground. And that will see investment in the order of $40 million out to 2025, developing really promising technologies and adoption programs for industry. On the other side of the equation, we also need to be promoting carbon storage in a productive way for the industry. And that's going to occur in grazing properties. But selecting vegetation that enables multiple benefits is mission critical, whether that's a tree for shade and shelter, as well as carbon benefit and biodiversity benefit, or whether it's making use of available vegetation to retain the carbon store, again, for multiple benefits for the animal and for the landscape and for the environment. And so we've also formed a carbon storage partnership that's going to be looking at developing and deploying new vegetation species for the livestock sector in Australia. And we've already seen around $20 million of partnership formation in that area, which is being led out of the University of Tasmania, but has natural reach with some really great partners across the country. The fourth work area is an area that brings together the outputs of the emissions avoidance and carbon storage area, but enables reporting and measurement, reporting, verification, such that we can track progress over time, and producers can have farm management tools that enable them to measure and verify and report their change over time to meet current and future market requirements in this area. And so we're calling that the integrated management systems area, where we integrate the output of emissions avoidance and carbon storage into a measurement and reporting platform. We're also supporting the development of measurement methodologies that enable producers to generate carbon credits using some of these promising technologies like feed additives. And we know that if we do these things really well in these 4 areas, we are going to unlock multiple benefits to the industry in the form of demonstrated environmental stewardship, increased profitability and increased animal productivity. Next slide, please. A little bit about progress to date. It's really important to note that total net greenhouse gas emissions attributed to the red meat sector is around 55 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, or around 10% of the country's national accounts. Now that's using the Australian federal government's GWP 100 greenhouse gas accounting metric. It's extraordinary to think that the Australian red meat industry has more than halved emissions since 2005, from around 120 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent down to around that 50 million tonnes. There's no other sector in the economy that has demonstrated that progress over time. But the reduction in net emissions has been achieved primarily through reductions in land clearing plus regeneration of woody vegetation. However, at the same time, continued improvements in production efficiency have reduced methane emissions per unit of product, demonstrating that the industry can remain productive whilst reducing net emissions. The industry can remain productive and profitable whilst reducing net emissions. It's also important to note that because of geological, topographic and climatic factors, less than 8% of Australia's land is suitable for crop production. Less than 8% of Australian land is suitable for crop production. That's a fundamental point when considering land use options in Australia. For the most part, Australia is a hot and dry landscape, which limits land use options in the majority of locations. One of those options is ruminant agriculture, because by design, ruminants can eat and convert plants that grow in areas where crops cannot into protein for human consumption, in addition to the myriad of other products in non-meat markets. That's why around 355 million hectares, or around a half of Australia's land mass, or nearly 90% of agricultural land, is used for grazing livestock. This means that the red meat industry controls large tracts of land that offers a carbon storage solution for Australia if managed correctly, using contemporary technologies and practices that deliver productivity-led reductions in emissions and improvements in carbon storage over decadal timeframes. Now, if we apply all these things well, we can limit industry's contribution to temperature rise without requiring any adjustment to livestock numbers. And in fact, industry has the capacity to for future productivity growth whilst meeting global temperature targets under the Paris Agreement. And that is significant for the Australian red meat industry when we trade in a global meat market. Australian sheep meat production is not causing additional temperature rise, and beef isn't far behind. And the emissions avoidance and carbon storage partnerships formed recently will enable producers to capitalise on market opportunities for low carbon and carbon neutral products today and into the future. Next slide, please. A little bit on the path ahead and key milestones to achieve CN30. In 2020, industry, or MLA, and our partners released the next generation carbon accounting tools for producers, which is available on MLA website. We also started to pilot some carbon neutral extension adoption packages for producers, which will see the launch of the first carbon edge package for producers later this year or early next. As we get out to 2023, we'll be looking to see technologies become available for the sector to use. And of a lot of interest to producers and stakeholders nationally, internationally, have been some of the emerging livestock feed supplements, which we'll see hit feedlots and dairies in the coming years. the same time, whilst these technologies are coming to market, it's fundamentally important that the industry is recognised for the environmental benefit created through its use. And to do that, we need scientific methods that tell producers very simply that if this technology is used in this particular way, for example, a feed additive is fed using this particular method, that a certain amount of carbon credits can be generated by that producer and therefore traded in the market, whether it's attached to a red meat product they supply to a value chain or whether they choose to sell the carbon credit into a voluntary market. As we get out to 2025, we'd expect to see large-scale uptake of Savannah fire management methods in Northern Australia. It's already a significant part of operating Northern Australian pastoral enterprises. However, our insights are that there could be up to 40 million hectares of Northern Australian land used for Savannah fire management methods, creating in excess of 10 million additional carbon credits a year for the sector. As we get out to 2030, this is where we'd be looking to see some significant uptake and adoption of some promising technologies. So, for example, tropical legumes, where it could be as many as 25 million hectares of new legume plantings established by producers, increasing livestock productivity substantially and reducing livestock methane emissions along the way. Supplements being used in the vast majority of feedlots and even in some supplementary feeding programs in extensive arrangements that increase live weight gain by up to 10% and decrease enteric methane by up to 90%. And we could expect to see them used in potentially 40% of the national herd and even 75% of feedlots. Producers using vegetation management methods would be something that's becomes largely mainstream, and by using those methods can achieve multiple benefits. Now, we would anticipate that majority of revegetation activities would be occurring in Southern Australia, and it could be as much as 10 million hectares of the available 355 million hectares nationally, but with a Southern Australian focus. And so you can see there's some really large adoption targets there, but in the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving on. Next slide, please. I also wanted to leave you now with 10 things producers can do today, and that'll set us up nicely for discussion in Q&A. The first thing is to arm yourself with the right knowledge. There's lots of information available now on MLA's website, including tools that can help you develop a carbon account. So you need to know where you are before you can make decisions on what the future might hold. Once you've completed that, you can be considering herd and flock management practices that are good practice things to do to improve live weight gain per unit of product and per unit of methane emissions produced. And so there's some links there which you can access in your own time on our website. Things like the beef cattle herd management fact sheet that talk you through practices that deliver those outcomes. You should consider energy efficiency, renewable energy technologies that ultimately reduce carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel use on farm. Identify shade and shelter options on farm, which is also important for multiple benefits, including selecting the right tree and the vegetation species for your region. The other insight that we have for you is around looking at potential Savannah fire management methods, particularly with Northern Australian focus. Next slide, please. Monitoring and recording active dung beetle populations on farm. Planning for the delivery and distribution of new feeds and supplements, whether you're in a feedlot or in extensive grazing arrangement. Establishing deep-rooted palatable pastures and legumes that promote carbon storage into soils in particular. Consider what mix of pastures, legumes and trees are appropriate for your farm and your region. And look at collaborative supply chain arrangements where groups of producers come together to increase supply of product, but even down the value chain, connecting producers with brand owners looking to make claims in this area. Next slide, please. So I'll leave you with a few insights on some work that's emerged from MLA programs. Consumers are the driving force behind sustainability action. Brands are the driving force behind carbon neutrality. So the consumers are looking for action, but it's the brands who are driving carbon neutrality movement. Any approach to carbon neutrality can be used by a brand. So consumers are less concerned about how an outcome is achieved, more concerned about the attribute that's on a pack has been assessed by a suitably qualified process and therefore is verified as being true. Brands require certification for consumers to buy in, and MLA supported market research has revealed that 1 in 4 consumers would be willing to pay 15% more for a carbon neutral red meat option. And on the right hand side there you can see a markup of an example of a product with a logo attached, communicating that claim to a consumer. And the next slide, please. So in summary, I just want to leave you with some key benefits for industry in engaging in this area. Maintaining consumer and community support for the industry, gaining market access to high value markets, particularly in Europe, in North America, maintaining access to capital, but also enabling access to growth capital to enable your business to grow in the future. Avoiding less blunt regulation where governments intervene due to lack of industry action in this area. And through the use of the right technologies and practices, we can enable more productive land, animals and people in the industry, which means increased revenue and maintaining our position as the trusted source of the highest quality protein. Next slide, please. So in summary, industry's made great progress and is well positioned to take advantage of future markets for climate-friendly red meat products. Production-driven reductions in livestock methane emissions is the key challenge ahead for us to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. The Carbon Neutral 2030 roadmap shows the way, so I encourage you to check it out and certainly provide feedback to MLA around the roadmap and the pathways described. And multiple benefits are on offer when the right technology is applied, but there's no silver bullet for industry. So we are placing multiple bets to deliver a cumulative outcome. In 2030, can you imagine that consumers buy Australian red meat knowing it's good for the environment and it's good for them? And with that, I'll hand back to Mick for Q&A. Thanks, Mick.
Thanks very much, Doug. Great work, and thanks, David, as well for your presentation. We've got time now for some Q&A, and there's been quite a few questions put into the Q&A. So while Doug gets his breath back, David, I might come to you first, if that's all right. There's a question here. The system-wide collaborative approach is terrific. Who orchestrates it? Is that MLA? And are there prime partners?
Thanks, Mick. So, yeah, look, that's a good question, and I might try and answer it by thinking. I think of the R&D as a bit of a triangle. So, there's from us, it's the producer priorities are critical. And that's listening to the producers and the regions and packaging those up to an outcome statement. Then there's the industry and what the industry's needs are, and then you've got the consumer and the consumer direction that is, I guess, also having a say in where our R&D needs should be. So to answer that question, I think if we're talking about understanding the producer outcomes and impact and industry, well then that will by and large be MLA led, but we'll find those investing partners. So that might be state agencies, commercial partners, other areas of the supply chain that are also interested in that impact. I think then we're not shying away from also being involved in other partnerships that might have been orchestrated in another area. So collaborating with others that might be focusing on an indirect industry benefit. So if it's producer-led, producer priorities, MLA orchestrated, but if there's a net benefit for the industry, and we'd also happily engaged if it's been orchestrated by others.
Thanks very much, David. And while we've still got you, there's a question here about the sheep reproduction strategic partnership. Just wondering if this work has looked at the differences in performance between breeds. Is this covered in the focus farms participating? Do you want to give a bit more detail around that, please?
Yeah, so I guess not necessarily, not really getting bogged down in the type of breed potentially, but we're recognizing that we have a number of best management practices which might sit, and I've said this word before, within a toolbox. So, and then different breeds then might have different levers to pull in order to get those benefits from a reproductive performance. So we're not shying away from it's not a breed specific partnership. If there's groups that have similar breeds, similar interests around improving that reproductive performance, we'd certainly happily engage, we'll work with those, but recognise that there just might be different structures to those PDSs based on the best management practices are going to be the best fit for that particular type of breed.
Yeah, thanks, David. That's good. Just while we're on the productivity piece, just in southern beef, can you give an update what's happening with southern beef research? The question refers to two programs, one in SA on heifer management and another one with McKinnon looking at herd performance and recommendations for further research. Any outcomes from that southern work or any other work in the south for the beef industry you want to highlight?
Yes, I think I reckon, and I've seen that question pop up as well. So I think that this is recognising the fact that, again, through that our producer consultation framework, there was a need or emphasis to look at that southern beef, similar to the north, I guess, in a sense, and how we can improve reproductive performance. So the answer to that question is yes. There is a large-scale project on the way. It was actually reviewed last week internally within MLA. So that will very much be focused on a similar type of PDS on I'm going to call it PDS on steroids approach to looking at that southern beef reproductive performance.
Thanks, David. Doug, can we just come back to you for a minute? Look, the question here is that we know that there are costs to sustainability, but what are the income benefits? Are there plans for a retail premium to be passed back along the supply chain to the producers?
It's a tricky one for MLA to answer that question, Mick, but our insights are that where we are providing a new service alongside red meat production, and what we're providing here is an environmental service, there's an underlying trend towards that being valued in the community. So the challenge for brands and the marketing story for the industry is to capture the benefit we provide in producing red meat in an environmentally sustainable way and marketing that to consumers who are willing to reward us for that effort. And there's some good examples of that happening now. Different brands in the market are offering these brand credentials. The extent to which that flows back to the producer is a supply chain arrangement that is under development at the moment. I think brand owners are feeling out what is a potential new value capture for brands or products with these attributes, and then putting in place reward mechanisms for their suppliers to ensure that there's enough supply of product to meet that demand.
Thanks, Doug. Just while you're on that, just looking at the carbon market, there's a question here on where's the best bang for buck in the market for carbon credits now and in the future?
So right now, the best place for a carbon credit is probably not surprisingly to producers on farm, in soil or in or in vegetation for animal production. So another way of describing that is it's best left in the farming system. Australian farming system is a low carbon farming system, so there's not enough carbon in our system as it stands. So anything we can do to leave that in a fixed form in the agricultural system in Australia is going to help productivity of the system. If you then do choose to sell it and market, there are multiple ways in which you can do so. And our insights are that a low or carbon neutral branded product with the carbon credit attached to it might be a significantly more rewarding pathway to market the credit than to sell it in the markets in Australia, which are at this point in time trading at a relatively low value, and that may change over time. So there's some insights there, Mick, around best bang for buck.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Doug. So just while we're on that, there's a good question here. What's the beef with methane from cattle? Aren't they part of a natural cycle and we have nothing to worry about?
Cattle or ruminants absolutely are part of the natural cycle, and God willing, they will be for millennia to come. The beef, I believe, in the carbon accounting world is that where there's a man-made intervention that might artificially inflate a natural population, that is causing an additional amount of methane and global temperature rise. So it goes beyond what might be a natural system. So that's one element of the equation, is ensuring that once we read a static global herd and flock, which we largely have, that we're not artificially inflating that beyond what might occur naturally. It's also important to note, whilst we're on the topic of natural cycles, that methane or the carbon that's in methane from ruminant digestion would ordinarily have made its way to the atmosphere in one way, shape or form if it wasn't via the digestive process of a ruminant. And so it's deemed not necessarily a new carbon to the atmosphere. It would have got there anyway in one other pathway. What is new carbon to the atmosphere is CO2 released from fossil fuel combustion. And so it is important that when we look at this cycle of carbon, that as a community and globally, we are really focused on what is additional carbon to the atmosphere, and that is fossil fuel use. So there's some interesting insights emerging out of that work, Mick.
Thanks, Doug. I think we've probably got time just for one more question. So as Jason mentioned before, we will respond to the other questions we've received, and there are a few that have come through on the chat. So Doug, how much of the supply chain will be covered by the CN30 program? Will products be carbon neutral up until the animal hits the abattoir, or will the abattoirs themselves be covered by CN30 and onto the distribution centres, retail, through to, retail food service?
Yeah. So two ways of answering that question. One is from a top-down approach versus a bottom-up approach. And so by top-down, I mean the Australian government's National Greenhouse Gas Inventory Account provides a whole picture of the economy. And so when we talk about 53% emissions reductions over time, we utilise the whole of red meat industry statistics to determine how much emissions are occurring in the industry, how much carbon storage is going on, and therefore the overall progress as an industry. So that enables us to make the statements that we do, domestically and internationally. When it comes to the mechanics of individual entities within the industry making claims, that's your bottom-up approach. So if you wish to engage in the industry to make claims, you then obviously have to construct your own carbon account that can show where you are, progress over time, such that you can validate your claim. And that's connecting a producer with a feedlotter or with a processor and having their own carbon accounts completed, such that when a brand is generated, what goes on the pack has been measured and verified within that supply chain system. And so we're seeing that happen already. There's a number of brands that are in the market at the moment. NAPCO's 5 Founders, for example. There are various others who are trading on these terms at the moment, and that's how they've reached that point. They've developed their own carbon account and approach to managing net emissions over time.
Thanks, Doug. That's a great explanation. And look, I just want to thank both Doug and David for your expertise on the call today. As I mentioned, we'll come back on the questions that we didn't get to today and respond to those questions by the end of this week. We'll also be providing a copy of the recording of this webinar on our website. We'd love your feedback. There will be a link that gets sent to you that is a short survey, and we'd love your feedback on the webinar. And also would greatly welcome your interest and attendance at the next webinar, which is Impact Through Strengthened Integrity Systems. That's next Monday on the 1st of November. Now, if you haven't registered, you still can. Just please visit updates.mla.com.au. So thanks everyone for your time on the webinar today, and we will call the webinar to a close. Thanks very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day and week. Thank you.